Welcome to Make It Brave, a show where we share inspiring stories of entrepreneurs, leaders, creatives, and innovators about the courageous decisions they make every day to create the life and business they've dreamed about. I'm your host, Laura Click, and I hope that this show helps you live your life a little braver. When I was introduced to Jennifer Grimson and I invited her to be on the show, it was well before we were in the middle of a pandemic. And even though her story is truly compelling, I think it has even more relevance for the state we find ourselves in right now. You see, Jennifer lost everything twice. Each time she had no money, no job, no car, and no place to live. Plus, she was supporting her 2 children. She successfully rebuilt her life from scratch and has built several of what she calls micro empires. And now she's sharing her story and the steps she took to dig out of the hole she was in and to build wealth. As many people find themselves in financial hardship right now with the coronavirus, Jennifer also shares some tangible steps people can take right now as they navigate these difficult waters. You can find some of those tips at the end of the episode, and I hope that you find these helpful. Well, I always love to start conversations at the beginning and learning where people are from and their background a little bit, because most people are not from Nashville. So I would love to know where you are from and hear a little bit about your childhood.
I grew up in southern New Hampshire, so right on the border of Massachusetts. In fact, if you saw the movie The Fighter, which took place in Lowell, Massachusetts, that's where I went to college for a little while, which was 7 minutes from my front door. So New England is a little different. New Hampshire is where the southern part is very Boston, and the northern part of New Hampshire, it's like a whole other world, even though it's a teeny tiny little state. I was raised by 2 parents who grew up in Boston and grew up fairly poor. My father was an engineer. My mother was a homemaker until I went to school. I was the youngest of 6. And so when I went to school, finally, she went back to work as the secretary of the schools. And that's pretty much how I was raised, in a sort of, I would call it a blue collar town, but my dad was an engineer. So that made us bluish color, gray color. But there were 8 of us in the house. So that's, sort of, and I ask people about their beginnings as well. And so I always ask about the culture of money that they grew up in. And I grew up in a culture of save every dime, don't ever have credit card debt, don't take risk, work hard.
Excuse me.
That's okay. You all right?
Yeah, I'm fine. Just the tickle comes on at the worst possible time.
Of course.
Yeah, totally good. Yeah. That's really interesting that you ask about the culture of money. So you said it was a very much a save all your money kind of thing. I think I grew up that way too. My grandparents were very much saving for a rainy day, and it came to a point as they were older, it's like, you're running out of rainy days. You can actually use some of that
Right.
money that you have. Is that kind of the mentality? It was like, you just save it forever.
Yes, save for a rainy day. And when I was 8 years old, my father lost his job, and it was like, the worst possible thing that could ever happen in our family. He lost his job, and then he was out of work for a year. And so I was 8, but my siblings were, the 5 of them were only 5 years apart and 5 years older than me. So they were 5 and 5 years, and 5 years later was me. So it was very much like a group of them and then me. So they all got jobs, and my mother got 2 jobs, and they worked, and we went immediately to hanging the clothes on the line to dry, even in January in New England, which means they freeze. Your jeans freeze, and you stand them up in the corner when they come in, and to drinking powdered milk, and to using the fireplace, etc. A little, they had, and my parents were fortunate, they had a lot saved up and they were able to survive, but it took them a year to get a job. And when he did get a job, it was in Washington, D.C., which is like a 13, 14-hour drive. So then my parents were separated for a year while he lived down there in a little apartment, which was it just exacerbated the fear factor around money, as it was anyway. And so my experience being 8 and like my oldest sibling being 18, was that there was a lot of fear around money. And since I was in the home longer than anybody else, my dad worked at a job that he hated, for the rest of his life. And, it was always about saving for retirement. Well, they, um, yeah, let's see, my dad was the January before he turned 64, he took early retirement. So just a few months early. He turned 65 in March, and in August was diagnosed with a brain tumor and was gone, inside of 6 months.
Oh, wow.
And that, and with a brain tumor, it's not a good 6 months. It's a good 6 weeks, 8 weeks, maybe. And that really, for me, solidified like all of this work, all of this waiting, all of this putting off, and they didn't get to do any of it. And then the shift, the beginning of the shift of the money culture for me came when I read The 4-Hour Work Week, which I read when it first came out. I think it's got to be 20 years ago. I don't know how old it is. But the idea of taking tiny retirements as you go along. And there was a gift in that where from that point on, I made the decision of, I don't really want to climb up corporate ladder. I want to seek time and freedom. And if that means I take long weekends every weekend for my entire working career, and that's my retirement, then at least I got it in before something happens. But anyway, that was my money culture.
Wow. I mean, so how old were you when your father was diagnosed with the brain tumor?
It was a big year. I was 29, and I didn't know it yet, but I was about to go through a really awful divorce. So my father died in January, and I officially separated from my husband, I think in February of 1998. So a long time ago.
Wow.
Long time ago.
Okay, I want to get to that in a minute. I want to think a little bit about, you were talking about how you were raised and, watching your father lose his job and everyone going to work, which, gosh, that must have been really impactful for you as a child to watch and see all of that. So how did that shape your career decisions and what you aspired to be as a child? What did you originally want to be, and did that shift after all of those things happened?
It's funny. I had not thought back to that time until very recently. As a small child, I'd always wanted to be an artist, um, a painter, etc. And seeing my dad do that, and then not just me, my own experience, but the entire family and the fear factor that goes along with, we're poor or we're struggling. Not that my parents called us poor, but there was a period of time where I had free lunch or I had hand-me-downs. I remember I wore a jacket to school that someone had given me, and the girl said, "Hey, that's my jacket." And I came home, I told my mother, and she ripped it off my back. She was so angry that anybody would point it out, that someone had given me a jacket. So there was a lot of fear around that. I think I took the normal path for what would be expected. I was expected to go to college. I actually graduated from high school early. I loved working. I've always loved working. I've never been a great student. When I say that, I mean, I got okay grades, but I never one of these people that was like, gee, I can't wait to get my PhD. I just was trying to get through high school. So I graduated early, and there were only 100 kids in my class, and I was the only person to graduate. So when I graduated, it was like the bell rang, and I was like, all right, well, bye. Just later.
Yeah.
And I walked out. But I wasn't, I wasn't like a popular kid in high school or anything like that. It didn't really fit in. But I had jobs, and I loved working. I loved working, and I loved money, and I loved the freedom that it gave me. And that was the first lesson about money, was that I was waitressing, I was working in a restaurant, I was cooking in a kitchen. But I loved that adult responsibility of doing all of those things. But I did go to college. Like I said, I went to school actually at the University of Lowell, which is now the University of Massachusetts in Lowell, Massachusetts. And it was very much like high school. And I was being like, this is miserable. It wasn't a different experience. So I lived in the Cape, worked as a bartender, and then ultimately went out to California. And that's when I went back to school, to San Francisco State, and studied what I really loved, which was international relations and Russian language. And that didn't lead to any jobs. I I envisioned myself being a foreign service officer or
Sure.
being in the Peace Corps, but I got married in college, which can kind of put a damper on things. And, just needed to get a job and then, quickly had a child. So that sort of changed everything. Um, but I would say I lived in that idea. My ideas about money have shifted radically over the years. I lived in a financially chaotic marriage. My first marriage was very financially chaotic, uh, which is worse, I think, than poverty. It's worse than underemployment. It's worse than a lot of things, is when it's chaotic. And when I first separated from my ex-husband, one of the first things I realized was I didn't need to make a lot of money. I just needed to make a steady amount of money. And I was able to support me and the children, I mean, on a shoestring. And I always knew, and that gave me peace. That gave me calm. And then over the years, my ideas, if you know my story, then I ended up being dragged through the ringer in bankruptcy a couple of times and $500,000 in attorney's fees, and living in a lot of fear and working and making, as much money as I possibly could to survive all of this. And the shift coming the second time that I had to rebuild from nothing to, if I'm going to do this again, I can't be dependent on if I lose a job or I make another mistake in a relationship or anything. There has to be tiny micro empires that will support me. And that's kind of what I started to build.
So there's a lot there. So we're going to get to all of these things. So you went to college, you got married, it sounds like did you get at some sort of job after you graduated, or you said you had your first child soon thereafter. So were you working out of college, or were you staying home with your child, or kind of what was the situation at that point?
I was working. I was always working. Straight out of college, I couldn't get a job. So I graduated in '94 and I couldn't really find a job. So I was still waitressing and, bartending, catering, whatever I could do. And then I landed my first job as a customer service rep for a technology company. And it was like, I had visions in my mind of $27,000 and my salary was $19,000. But it had health insurance, et cetera. My ex-husband was a builder, general contractor. So his income would ebb and flow, but also very chaotic. His own culture of money was very opposite. I think this is really important when choosing a partner. You really have to be melded with regard to your culture of money. I personally don't understand how it can work otherwise. If one person has a relationship with money that is totally different than the other person. And his was very tied into his self-worth, how he had been cared for or not cared for. The one thing about money with me growing up, whether we had money or not, I never equated it to whether or not I was loved or cared for. I felt like my parents, like it really was their job. Like I really still was the kid. Maybe my teenage siblings felt like they were taking responsibility. But as a kid, I remember still whining that I wanted something for Christmas and not caring how much money we had, or, when the electricity went out, I still wanted dinner cooked for me, So, and I mean, that's how kids are supposed to be. They're not supposed to be really worried. And that wasn't true for him. And so money had a real hold on him and how it made him feel. I could eat rice and beans every single day for my entire life, and it doesn't affect who I am as a human being. For him, not having a beautiful meal that's purchased at a restaurant makes him feel less human. And I think that's true for a lot of people. Whether it's you're buying shoes and purses and cars or whatever it is that your relationship with money is really important. And it speaks to how you do everything, how you parent, how you're a partner, how you feel about yourself.
Yeah, wow. And I don't know that when people are choosing partners that they go, let's look at the checklist and what is your relationship with money? I don't think that's a question that people are asking on the, first date for sure, but definitely not even on the 10th date, probably. And you don't really know until you're in the throes of it. You don't really get a kind of a peek into that until you're really, until you're married, probably in a lot of cases. I mean, maybe you have some clues, but I don't know that you really get it until you're paying the bills together and managing accounts together, that you really see how people treat money, I would imagine. So
Yes.
you saw that. I don't want to say when it was too late, but it sounds like you saw it when it was too late, and it
Oh
sounds
yeah.
like one of the things that kind of led to your marriage unwinding. So you hinted at that a little bit ago, that so the same year you lose your father, then you start to go down the road of divorce, which I can't imagine how hard it must have been to go through both of those things at the same time. They're equally difficult things, and
Yeah.
all at once makes it even worse. It compounds it. So tell me a little bit about that situation, because I know that's a big part of your story, is that getting that divorce, and it led to a whole host of things. So I won't steal the thunder. I'll let you tell us a little bit about what happened then.
Well, the relationship with my ex-husband, I mean, I met him, I was 21 years old. He was my first real boyfriend, and he was the first person to really tell me that he loved me. And when I say real boyfriend, I mean somebody who, like, you tried to pay bills with, or you tried to, like, you're trying to play house. But he was 10 years older than me. So it was very much, there was a lot of immaturity on my side as well. Uh, but yeah, I came home from burying my father, and the realization that my marriage was over hit me square in the face at that time. And it was terrible. There's a lot to be said for, when you're in a terrible car accident, that shock keeps you alive or keeps you from feeling the pain. And there were many years in my life that I think I just was in shock. My children were 1 and 3 years old, and it was just about surviving. And so, what that started, I mean, initially, it's even like today, in today's world and what we're dealing with now. I mean, initially, it's like, what is happening right now? What has to happen today? And I have this methodology that I've used kind of over the years. It's like 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. So the next 10 minutes, the next 10 hours, the next 10 days, 10 weeks, 10 months. And that's how I survive, because a lot of times we say, stay in the moment, focus on today. And I get that, but I'm a planner, and I can't sleep without a plan. I was a single mother from the time they were 1 and 3, and that was it. And so I needed to know, how can I get through the next 10 minutes? Because that's something I can accomplish. And I think today, and speaking to a lot of people who are in different situations, people who've lost their entire savings and everything, lost their job, being able to focus on what can you do in the next 10 minutes and the next 10 hours, which is a work day, gives people a little bit of something to focus on. And then at this stage, in 10 days, the world could be totally different. We don't know what it's going to be like, but we can focus on the things that we can control, what things you buy, what you sell, what you do next, etc. But yeah, so that quickly devolved into the divorce. We were separated for about a year. I was living in an apartment in California, and then I ultimately was given custody and permission to move back to New England. So I did. I moved into my mother's house where I grew up, and moved back into my old bedroom, and lived with my mom for 2 years, 9 months, 8 days, and 49 seconds. Look who's calling.
No adult ever wants to go back and move with their parents. Never.
Oh my God. If you ever saw the movie Hope Floats with Sandra Bullock, that was kind of my life. So, and as a mom, you never stop being a mom. And so my mother, in the morning, I'm 30 years old, every morning she was like, "Did you eat breakfast? What are you wearing today?" And you're just like, "I'm an adult, leave me alone." But I do the same thing to my adult daughter now. And you never stop being a mom. And to be completely fair, it was much harder on my mother, who sacrificed a lot to have us there. But yeah, we lived there, and I started to rebuild, got a job, built a house right next door to her, and started to rebuild, and then ultimately had to file bankruptcy, which saved the house that I built, gave another whole host of problems in terms of credit, et cetera. And you can listen to it in the podcast and for details on that. But that was sort of the beginning. And I ended up, I'll just give you the quick synopsis. I mean, over time, over the next 10 years, my ex-husband sued me 25 times.
Wow.
And that led to $500,000 in attorney's fees and 2 bankruptcies. And the bankruptcies, the particular ones that I filed, were Chapter 13s. which ruins your credit for 10 years. So yes, you can escape the debt. Although there's caveats, I actually had to pay back creditors, which is fair. And I was completely, paid all those debts. But it ruins your credit. So here I am working for a corporation as a sales executive or a project manager or whatever, and I can't get a credit card, which means you can't rent a car or get a hotel room. There are a lot of things you can't do without a credit card in this country.
Yeah.
So there's, and so I talk about in my podcast in great detail, like the strategies for literally rebuilding the credit. Like I go through step by step by step. So I don't want to go through all that here, but
No, yeah, we'll have links to the show notes. I mean, you're good, but I mean, the bottom line is you went through a devastating divorce. You lost everything. You were bankrupt. You were living with your mother, and then had to start from scratch while working and being a single mom. I mean, that is really hard.
yep, it is. And it is hard, but it is the story of a lot of people and a lot of women. It's what I found. A lot of this I kept a secret probably until last year. There was only the close group of people around me. When I decided to start the podcast, I thought I have to tell the story or I have no credibility. But I kept it a secret because there's so much shame around it. And what I find is the more I tell the story, the more people will share with me, I'm in the same, or my husband and I are in debt and I don't know what to do. I'm going to lose everything. I met a woman the other day. I think she makes $300,000, and she was here in Nashville looking at renting a house of mine, and she couldn't afford the rent.
Wow.
And that's the reality. That's the reality. And we aren't taught like home economics. We're taught how to make a cake and how to build a shelf in high school, but we're not taught about compounding interest, how it can serve you and how it can hurt you. What the reality is of buying a house and how it will affect you versus investing it in other ways, how everything is negotiable, your salary, your cars, that you should ask for everything, especially women, ask for what you want in your job and your income, your vacation, your relationships, what you want physically, emotionally, spiritually, sexually. So those are the things that I see there's a real gap, and we're sort of intuitively taught like money is a little uncomfortable. Let's not ask each other about it. I shouldn't ask you how much you make every year. I shouldn't ask you how much your car cost or anything like that. So I think that hasn't served most of us very well.
Well, and especially women. I mean, your point about asking for things and negotiating, I don't think that women are taught to negotiate at all. I mean, just something as simple as salary is something that everyone should negotiate. You should never take the first offer, but I think that's not something. I mean, I know I never learned that along the way. And my husband is an attorney. I sat in on a class of his. So we got married when he was in law school. And I sat in on a class of his on negotiating so I could learn how to better negotiate. And it's one of those things that I think we all need to learn how to do, but we're never, especially women, told to do or encouraged to do or taught how to do. So it sounds like you learned that, but through a lot of very difficult circumstances, you had to find it out because you had no other choice, right?
Right. I think negotiating is really important. There's a book called Women Don't Ask. It's a really depressing but necessary read.
Great.
It
wait.
is, it's loaded with statistics. I read a lot, meaning I listen to Audible books a lot. But that book was really eye-opening because I didn't know the numbers. So you're right, women don't negotiate specifically, it just takes salary. And that non-negotiation from the beginning of their careers to the end of the careers usually equals about $500,000. So if the same person, and Sherry Deutschman gave this example in my interview, the same person, two people came into her for interviews for jobs, a man and a woman. She offered them both $45,000 a year. The woman said yes, the man negotiated a higher salary. Then he came back 3 times and asked for a raise, and she gave it to him. The woman never asked. And finally, one day, Sherry was sitting with that woman, and the man walked by the door, and she said, "Do you know Bob makes a lot more money than you?" And the woman was so angry, but she never asked. And I've found, just this podcast, I have a production company that is fronting all the production because they believe in it. They believe in the message because I asked. I went to Podcast Movement with nothing more than a business card and an idea. I didn't have a single recorded episode. And I just asked, and I told my story, and I told it to big networks, and there was interest. It didn't land me some giant contract or anything, but my idea was to just see if there was interest in what I was talking about and the messages that I wanted to share. But again, I just think even right now, we talk about what's happening right now with COVID-19. Problem number one, what's happening to us right now is a healthcare crisis. It has caused a financial crisis. None of us can do anything about the financial crisis until we solve problem one. So, and all we can do, unless you're a nurse or a doctor, is to stay inside and stop the spread. So this is the time when developing a plan, maybe call your mortgage company and ask them to delay your payments. Some of them are offering a delay for up to a year with no penalty or taxes. Call your landlord. Ask them if you can get a reduction in rent, if you could do a payment process. Same thing with your credit card, same thing with your cars. Start looking at when I look at the 10, 10, 10, and 10, I start thinking, are we going to need to have family move in with us at some point? Maybe. That's nobody's dream. But I have a room with an extra bathroom upstairs and have the space, and start thinking about what the things that are uncomfortable, getting comfortable with it, pivoting. This has been my business all along. You can either sit now and wait, and maybe in a few weeks you'll be back to work and everything will be great, or you can start strategizing about how can I offer what I have to offer in a different way that can deliver, that can pivot, that can ask people who've lost everything, especially those in the stock market. I don't know enough about that, but if I were in that circumstance, I might be calling people or advising with people who've had that experience, and what else I could do to pivot in the meantime, because there's really nothing you can do. You don't want to take your money out now because it's probably just dwindled. So at this point, probably leave it all in. But this is the time to be asking yourself and others.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for you having gone through, and one of the things we haven't mentioned, so you lost everything one time. It happened a second time too.
Second time. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't have enough fun. I didn't have enough fun the first time.
So and I want to come back to some of these other things, but give us the cliff notes of what happened there. So you moved in with your mother, you've got your kids, you're rebuilding everything. I believe at some point you that's how you end up in Nashville. You end up at Nashville at some point, but you don't have to give the whole story if you don't want. But you went through this a second time, which I think that means you've got the double dose of bravery and resiliency that you've built yourself back up from that. But share a little bit about that piece of your story.
Yeah, the second time, it's really, if you look at my financial, people ask about what's your biggest financial mistakes. My biggest financial mistakes have been relational. So it's never been that I love to drive, a Range Rover and have expensive clothes. I'm just not wired that way. It's been my relational decisions, meaning what I've done in relationships. So my marriage was one. And then I was living in New England, yes, and I met someone here in Tennessee. I was also working for a Tennessee-based company, and we dated for 1.5 years. And he said, "Why don't you move down here?" So I did. I brought my mother with me, and she still lives here today. And after 1.5 years, he wanted me to move in, and we moved in with him. But he was like, "I really want you to quit your job." And at the time, my ex-husband was still relentlessly suing me. Now, one thing about bankruptcy, you can't get blood from a turnip. So, I kept earning all of this money, and a lot of the motivation for suing was money or power or control or whatever. And my belief had been, well, I've got to earn money so that I can fight him so I could pay the attorneys. Well, the opposite can be true. You can just stop and then have nothing. What do you want now? You want to sue me for my shoe collection of, 5 pairs of sneakers? Okay. So my boyfriend wanted me to quit my job and had the means for us to live with him inexpensively. And my children were in school. And he said, you've never gotten to stay at home with the kids. and I want to see you be able to do this. And I really wanted that too. So I did. I quit my job. I filed bankruptcy. I had a small job. You have to have a job when you have bankruptcy. So I had a small, but I had an income that was, a quarter or a tenth. I don't even know what it was of what I had made before. My asset was gone, which was the house that I built in New England. And I literally had no assets and no expenses whatsoever, and was living with him, and was able to do that for 4 years. And I try to focus on the positive. I'm very grateful for that time. I really enjoyed it. I loved being a stay-at-home mom. It's pretty awesome. But the price I paid, relationally in that relationship was high, because it was a relationship that at the time made sense, but wouldn't make sense now. But the one thing that I did have was I had this $47,000 401k that I talk about in my episodes, and it kind of had just been hanging out there. And I always kind of thought, if anything happens, I at least have that. And yes, if I cash it in, there's penalty and taxes, but there's a way to get around that. If you don't have, like, if you're really poor and you just take that out, then usually your taxes and penalty can sometimes be waived. But anyway, that was my belief, that if anything happens, it's okay. I can have that to rent an apartment or put a down payment on a house or do something and get started over again. And I'll just go back to the corporate world. I mean, there's still corporate America. I can go back there and work. Well, as the relationship, he had asked for me to roll the 401k into the 401k at his business, and I had agreed to do so. I pulled it out and gave it to him, and he was supposed to then roll it over. Well, he didn't do that. He just cashed the check and took the money. But I didn't know that. So when our relationship eventually ended, I said I would like my $47,000 back. And he said, oh, no, that was a gift. So that
Yeah.
was fun. So
I'm sure you had some choice words, or I have choice words for you as I'm hearing it again after listening to it previously. But
yeah, I'm only smiling because what are your choices? Laugh or cry.
That's right. That's right.
The one thing I did, and this is when you ask people about how they feel about relationships or other things, they'll often say, whether it's, do you want to get married? I don't know if I want to get married, blah, blah, blah. Oh, deep down is where all the truth is. That's where everything is. So we should stop thinking about, deep down, I think this. Deep down should be like right at the front. So when we were going through the 401k thing, I had asked for it in writing. It's a transaction. So sure, I'll roll it over to your company, but put it in writing. He did. We'd signed copies. He at some point had asked for it back, the signed copy back, and I gave it back to him, and then it miraculously disappeared. What he didn't know was that I kept a copy of it, and what he had done was illegal. So, I just went to him and said, you have a choice. You can either get me the money by tonight, or I can, file a claim and, file charges against you for stealing my money from me. So miraculously, the money showed up, but there was an $18,000 penalty. So that dwindled that down to $29,000. But that is part of the nest egg that helped me to rebuild. But I had to, at that second time around, instead of moving in with my mother, I moved in with my sister and her husband, and they had one child in college and one in high school, and they let us move in. We were there for 4 months, and that wasn't their dream come true. That's for sure. And they were wonderful. And it gave me a chance to, catch my breath, look for a job. And I found a job, and then I was able to get a place to live. But without that place to live, that's when you become vulnerable. That's when you ask for everything and anything. I asked everybody I knew for interviews and jobs, and, you get really humble and you figure it out.
So what do you do now? So now you've built yourself back from all of this, and you, and we'll have a link to your podcast that you've mentioned a number of times, Micro Empires. But in addition to being a podcaster, what else are you doing now?
Well, the Micro Empires came from the second time rebuilding. What I did, the first thing I did was I was able to purchase a house. It took a long time to get there. And then I found short-term rental in Airbnb. I was an early adopter here in Nashville, probably in 2014 is when I started. And that allowed me to buy a second house and then a third house on Airbnb, in addition to a corporate job, which was in healthcare technology. So in November of 2018, and this is about pivoting, um, I left my corporate job, not because I'd hit some windfall, but just because I thought I've got to start. I've made this promise to myself, and I've got to start. I've got to start something new, and so that's what I did. The houses actually didn't earn as well, and I can go into detail in another time. But I actually ended up selling those houses late last year and just about a month ago. So what I do is I'm an investor. So I invest in real estate, I invest in stocks, I invest in corporations. And I'm doing this podcast. Part of this podcast and the opportunity that I want is the ability to speak to groups and to share the story and share the experiences, but also for investment opportunities. So I would consider myself an investor.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I think, and we were saying this before we kind of really got into it, your story and what you've learned is probably going to be more valuable now than ever as we are recording this in the middle of the COVID-19 outbreak. And so many people we're recording this from our homes instead of our offices. We're all being asked to stay at home. Many people have lost jobs. Many people have lost income uh, almost overnight. And so we're in this state of uncertainty. And for many people are going to have to rebuild from some very big losses. So what advice can you share, or what, I mean, you've done this twice now. And, I guess I have two things. So let's start with first, I mean, this is a scary time right now. And so I would love to know what, having gone through some scary and difficult things yourself, how can you speak to the fear that people may be experiencing at this point?
Yes, and and then of course your podcast is called Make It Brave. So
Right.
it's a very hard time to be brave, and I think that for me, bravery comes in the knowledge that you're not alone. This is a time when people tend to hunker in, and I would argue that the only way you're going to feel security is to open up. And so, generosity over self. And when I say generosity, a lot of people, you're not going to have money or a business, and you may have had to fire people and lay people off, and you didn't want to do that, or you're that person who's lost all that. You can't make your rent, you can't even buy food. You're just in a really difficult position. But just a couple of things. I would say that bravery comes from having, for me anyway, it comes from feeling like at least I can do something for someone else and for myself. But what do I have to offer? What I have to offer may just be time to listen, experience that I've had in the past, honesty. I was talking to a friend the other day who is a real estate investor and is very frightened, like a lot of people are. Didn't seem to me that he had really accepted what was happening in the world, and was asking questions about investments that 2 weeks ago I would have had different answers to. And so when we talked, I said, I think the sooner you start to understand and accept the world has changed overnight, and what your priority isn't, gee, I have this deal over here on that I was going to do a 2 build over here, and I was working on this house that I was going to flip. The priority is you have a daughter, and you have to take care of that daughter. So what's going to serve her best today? What's the truth today? The truth is today, there's nobody out there that can buy that house unless they have cash. And I don't have the cash to buy it from you. And I'm not going to be able to get a loan at this moment for this particular product that you're looking for. And so so that might be an act of generosity, helping another person come to terms with, a lot of people just need to talk through what has happened to them. And a lot of people, I think, myself included, cling to, how do I keep the status quo? When I first broke up with the long-term boyfriend, my initial thought was, how do I keep my status quo? How do I rent a house in the same neighborhood, keep my kids in the same private schools that they were in, keep up my little lifestyle? The answer was I couldn't. I had to move to another county altogether because the schools were free. I had to live with my sister, and she and her family had to live with us for nearly 4.5 months. I had to beg someone to rent an apartment to me because I did not have credit because of my bankruptcies. So I think that the what people can do right now is to really just take stock. Okay, this is what's happened. I've lost my job. Our retirement has disappeared. But here's what else hasn't happened. I'm not in foreclosure. I do have the ability to negotiate. I can call a mortgage company, the credit card company, the car company. I can get rid of my car payment altogether and drive a little thing. I have not driven in a week. And of course, I live in an urban area, but I've heard gas has dropped down to like $1.50 a gallon or something like that. People are not driving. So it is the time to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, figuring out, sitting down with your spouse or your family and figuring out, how much cash do we have? What do we have to liquidate? What skills do we have? Can you teach English online? Do you have a skill that you could teach, like marketing? Or we have a mutual friend who's in marketing who's helping me now because I'm really bad at that. But these are all skills. And now is not the time to stop marketing. Now is not the time to stop networking. In fact, I would double down on those efforts, whether you can pay for it or not. My network is what has kept me alive through every tragedy. So that's what I would offer.
Yeah, I think that's really wise advice. And your point about the status quo, I think, is really important because I think the hard thing, and quite frankly, I'm still wrapping my head around it. There's a lot of uncertainty of how long we're going to be in this state. There's a big difference between, you mentioned that realtor you talked to, and what change can happen in 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, we could still be here, or maybe things have changed again, or are we going to be in this state for another several weeks, or is it going to be months? And those answers we don't have, and so it's I think that's what's the hard thing, is we're living in this land of limbo, hoping that in a few weeks or maybe in a few months things will return to normal. But the one thing is certain, that's not going to be the same normal as before. It's a new normal, and what does that look like, and how can we adapt and be prepared for that? And I think that's the challenge I think we're all trying to face right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So through all of the things that you have been through, you've done some pretty difficult things. You've started over a couple of times. Has there ever been a time where you have let fear stop you from doing something? Have you ever felt like you've been stopped in your tracks by fear before?
Oh yeah. Um, yeah. I think fear was my primary driving factor in my life. I'm going to say up until last November, November of 18, when I quit my corporate job. And that's not because I was not afraid. I was terribly afraid, but I was more afraid. I had just given a friend some advice, whether he wanted it or not. He was talking to me about his relationship, long-term relationship with somebody who he's struggled with for a long time. And I said, if you don't make space for someone else, then that other person can't come into your life. You're filling up your life with this person who doesn't fulfill you year after year after year. If you don't make space for a new person, you can't do it. And then I thought, what a hypocrite I am, because I work a job that takes 40 to 60 hours a week. I travel all the time. I don't like the job. If I don't make space for who I really am, and then I'll never know if I have the capability of doing anything. And when I had no idea that there would be a podcast. I still don't know, if that's going to monetize in any way. That's not the priority. The priority was to give myself some space and some time. And I was going to rely on the houses that I had generating the income. And like, as soon as I quit my job, the income dropped in a friend of mine who's a songwriter said, "Oh, that's just the universe checking see if you're serious." And I was like, "Well, the universe can kiss my butt." Because that's, I mean, like 3 months they sat empty. These are short-term rentals. Um, but I think that was truly, I think everything else I really do feel was driven by fear. I'd love to say that I was brave every single time. Don't really know that I was. I think that was the one time. And part of it was tied to, I didn't think I had the luxury of being super brave before because I had children who relied on me. And so I didn't feel like I should, like, it was really up to me. But yeah, I think I was driven by fear the majority of my life. Yeah, the other thing on a personal note, and I will say this, and I don't want to underplay it. I'm a newlywed. I will be married 2 years in May, and shocked because I was single for 20 years. So I mean, shocked that I met somebody that A, could tolerate me, and B, married me. Um, but there is security just having a partner. And this time right now, I think is scary for so many people, but the folks that are in their homes and are alone, completely alone, it's really hard just not to have that other person. So that has given me just the support and the love, and having somebody have your back when you're on your own. You really notice the difference when you have that.
For sure, for sure. So, talking about how you lived in fear so long, I mean, do you look at anything that you've done now, or I don't know if you look back and see your bravery now, or maybe you felt it at the time? I mean, what would you say is maybe the bravest thing you've ever done?
um, I look back now and I think either really brave or really stupid, because you never know which one it is. There are a couple of specific instances that come to mind. Uh, I remember when I was building my house in New England, because you have all these layers of a story, but then there's always another layer. I was building the house in New England, and I was already finding with all the lawsuits. And in New Hampshire, it's a live free or die state, so you don't actually have to have a contractor's license. So builder whose references I've checked and whose houses I've been to and whose customers I've met, and about three-quarters through the construction, maybe a third, I'm not sure, two-thirds, sorry, I found out that he'd never paid into the subcontractors to the tune of $70,000. And because because he didn't have to have a license, he had put everything in his wife's name. Anyway, bottom line, fired him, but realized that there was $70,000 that had never been paid to any of the subs. And of course, I'm still trying to get the money from finish the project. I fire him, I board up the house, I protect the house, and the subs come and start stealing the supplies out of the houses, et cetera.
Wow.
And so I went over and would sleep in the house, which again, I'd like to think is brave, but really is, because at the end of the day, it's a house. I'm a mother of 2 children. But I almost feel like the ignorance and the audacity I had of just, this is my property and you will not come on here, and you will not. And they would come up to my house where I was living with my mother, and they would threaten me, and I'd have to go out on the porch and yell at them to get off my property and yell at them to never come. And so those are things but that's, I mean, by pure necessity, that's not really who I am
Yeah.
as a whole. But I think as women, and I have my friend's daughter of mine who lived with me for a while, and she used to say to me, because her mom and I were best friends from the time we were 8 years old, and she says, "Well, I have my mom, and then you've been my dad, for a large part of her life when she was really young." And I think we're in those positions, especially when you're a single parent, or in a lot of situations, you've got to be the mother and the father, you've got to be the alpha and the omega. So that's just one I can think of. But yeah, I think now, I think now, in a time where this is a healthcare crisis, and so it's not something any of us can go, well, if I was just smarter with my money, or if I just this, if I just that. This is a time to be brave and to be kind and generous, and that alone is brave, because many people have the instinct of hoarding or staying in, and I'll take care of mine, and it's a battle. And I I think the vast majority of us have the opposite feeling where we're reaching each other virtually or spiritually or just in reaching out to one another of like, I'm in this too and I'm scared and we want the best for each other. So I think that is what we need to all do, just sort of dig in, focus on the generosity and the kindness that we are able to give.
I love that. It's beautiful advice. I mean, I think yeah, I mean, I think fear can drive you a lot of different ways, and so I think we shouldn't be afraid, but I think fear can also keep us safe. So there's a healthy fear that we have that's keeping us home and indoors. And that's a good thing, but we can't let it overwhelm us either. And so I think it's trying to have the healthy fear of what are the safe things I can do. But then let not that take over and be instead focusing on what can you do and how can we be kind to others and ourselves during this time. I mean, I think that's all we really can do at this point, really.
Yeah, that's true. That's
Yeah.
true.
Yeah. I don't know that I have any other questions for you. Is there something that we haven't talked about that you would want to talk about? I mean, I guess I have some other things I can pull from. Um, hmm. I think we've hit on a lot of the high points. Is there anything I've missed?
No, I think they really did. I didn't know what we would talk about today, but I appreciate you going into the background and everything. I wasn't even sure like if my background at this point in time is relevant, but I see where it is, and I think the only thing I'm trying to help other folks with is again, to focus on what is right now, not what could be or should be or would be, what is right now, and what we can do, each one of us in that area, and that is to stay home. And then, but that also counts for your individual circumstance. What is right now? Yes, have you lost your job? Have you not lost your job? Has your savings gone down? And then what you're able to do. I mean, I'm a believer in taking action steps, and the vast majority of people will just not ask, and now is the time to be asking. So whether it's mandated by the government or not, the mortgages are put on hold, et cetera, it doesn't hurt to be making those phone calls and figuring that out.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You've kind of hinted at that. So what you've listed some of those things. You mentioned mortgage. So what are the things that you would be encouraging people to ask for right now?
I would call my mortgage company and ask for a pause on the mortgage payments and interest and penalty for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. I mean, I'm a believer in go big or stay home. So
Yeah.
uh, if they're going to give you 9 months, 12 months, take it. And if you have a good, I mean, it depends on your mortgage company. They may say no, but I will say that there is interest rates are dropping. So if they do say no, assuming that you're able to, you could refinance and go with a different company. But that all remains to be seen. And there is going to be a lot of pressure on mortgage companies. If you are renting, I would recommend calling the landlord and having a direct conversation with them. Oftentimes it's a corporation and you're not able to do that. But if you have a landlord and you're able to call, I know for myself, being a renter and then also owning rental properties, I definitely want to work with somebody who at least called me and leveled with me. And it doesn't have to be, hey, I can't pay my rent. It can be, listen, I can pay half the rent for the next 4 months and let's tack it on to the end of the lease, and I'll re-sign another lease. I mean, everything is negotiable. And remember that these landlords don't need to have a bunch of empty houses either. But the government, if it just waives, the ability to evict, the landlords aren't going to be able to pay the mortgages. So there has to be some balance, and this will come to an end. And when it does, you want to be in good standing with those individuals. I would also negotiate with your credit card companies. I'd call them right up and ask them if you can delay payment for 30, 60, 90 days without penalty. I would look at what you could sell if you're in need of cash. Why not? I mean, what if it's a car or whatever, and what if we're out of this in 3 weeks? Who cares? Buy another one. If everything goes right back up to where it was. I'm just a believer in that. I happen to have a bunch of stuff left over from the houses I just sold, so I'll be selling little tiny items off. And then think about what you the 10, 10, 10, 10 thing really helps me. So think about, what if this is 10 weeks from now, and what are some of the measures you're willing to go to? And then also the talents that you have, how can you possibly pivot them to be something else? So I didn't imagine, I can go back and work in healthcare technology, and I would happily, because right now I think it's one of the few things that I could do that could actually help. But my skills might be better helping people just kind of cope with the day-to-day strategies of what they can.
I think that's great advice, and I'm mentally taking notes and thinking about the things that we need to do ourselves right now. So I think that is really helpful and actionable advice that people. I think it gives some power to people too, to feel like, hey, there are things I can do, and they might make a difference. And you can't control what they say, but you're right, you'll never know if you don't ask. And so I think you've highlighted a really important piece of advice, that we just need to be better at asking for the things that we want, because what's the worst that could happen?
Right.
They say no, and we're no worse off than where we started. So I think that's really good.
Yeah.
Good information.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
That was Jennifer Grimson. She is the host of the Micro Empires podcast. You can learn more about Jennifer and find all the ways you can listen to her show at micro-empires.com. I'll have a link to her show and all of the ways you can connect with Jennifer at makeitbrave.com. Thanks so much for listening. I am so glad you're here. And hey, if you're digging the show, would you leave me a review on iTunes? Your feedback helps me make the show even better for you, and reviews are a great way to help others discover the show. Plus, I might just give you a shout out on an upcoming episode. I look forward to being with you again soon. And just remember, whatever you do today, friends, don't forget to make it brave.